All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going to tackle a question that's been around for, about 2,000 years. It's a question that our sources suggest has challenged philosophers, kings, and maybe even you. So let's get into it.
So, who is Jesus, really? I mean, think about it. The sources we're looking at today point out something pretty incredible. Beyond all the religion and tradition, this one name, it's just stuck around. Empires have risen and fallen, entire civilizations have disappeared, but this name just remains. So what is it? Why can't we, as a civilization, seem to forget this one guy? And this is the part that's just so wild. When you look at his life through a purely historical lens, I mean, by any normal standard, he was, well, pretty insignificant. The sources say he never really traveled far, never got a formal education, and yet, here we are 2,000 years later, and his impact is, you just can't deny it. It's everywhere.
Okay, so where do you even put a figure like that? How do you categorize him? Was he just a good man? A great moral teacher? A lot of people land there. But the sources we're exploring today argue that those labels, as nice as they sound, they just don't seem to fit. They don't quite capture the whole story. Yeah, check this out. This is where it gets really interesting, because the sources throw down a direct challenge to these common ideas. Like, okay, a good teacher? Fine. But why do we literally split all of time, BC and AD, based on his life? That's not something we do for just any teacher. A revolutionary? Well, most revolutionaries I know of lead armies. They don't tell their followers to love their enemies and forgive the people killing them. The point the sources are making is that these easy answers, they just don't quite work when you look at the sheer scale of his impact.
And this right here, this is a perfect example of just how radical his teaching actually was. Billy Graham highlights this idea that Jesus took these moral laws that everyone knew, like don't murder, and he just cranked them up to a whole new level. He took it internal. It was no longer just about what you did. Suddenly, it was about what was going on inside your heart, your thoughts, your motivations. That's a game changer.
So, this leads to the big question, right? If good teacher or revolutionary doesn't quite fit, then what did he say he was? What did he actually claim for himself? This is where, according to the sources, everything changes.
And yeah, the answer to that question is, well, it's the central controversy of his entire life. The sources frame it this way. He made a claim. A claim so absolutely shocking, so completely world-altering that it got him killed. Simple as that.
And here it is. This is the moment. Of everything he ever said, the sources point to this one statement as the one that sealed his fate. Before Abraham was, I am. Now, to us, that might sound a little weird, maybe just an odd way of talking, but to his audience in that moment, whoa, this was absolutely explosive.
Okay, so to really get why this was so explosive, you have to understand the context. That phrase, I am, wasn't just him saying, I exist. In Hebrew, I am is Yahweh. It's the personal, sacred name of God himself. The name God gave to Moses back at the burning bush. It implies eternal self-existence, the creator of everything.
So let's be super clear here. He wasn't just saying, hey, I've been around a long time. He was claiming to be Yahweh, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham. And his audience, oh, they got it. They understood exactly what he was saying. The sources say their immediate reaction was to grab stones to execute him right there on the spot. Why? For blasphemy, the worst possible offense.
And this all leads to the official charges against him. According to Billy Graham's analysis, it boils down to three things. First, he was hanging out with sinners and outcasts, a huge social no-no. Second, he was healing people on the Sabbath, breaking a major religious law. But the third one, the final nail in the coffin, so to speak, was that he claimed to be the Son of God.
So that claim, that one shocking claim, is what sets everything in motion for the climax of his life story as we see it in these sources, the crucifixion. But what's fascinating is how they frame it. It's not presented as some tragic accident or a defeat, not at all. It's seen as a moment of ultimate purpose. And the accounts of his death are, well, they're brutal. The sources describe him being beaten, mocked, a crown of thorns jammed onto his head, and then nailed to a cross. It's just agonizing to even think about. But in the middle of all that, his response was just completely unexpected, something no one saw coming.
I mean, can you even imagine? In the middle of all that pain, being tortured to death, the sources say he looks at the very people doing it to him and says, Father, forgive them. Think about that. That's not a normal human reaction to that kind of agony and injustice. That's something else.
And then, right at the very end, with his last breath, he says these three words. And it's so important to get this right. He doesn't say, I am finished, like he's defeated. He says, it is finished.
And according to the sources, that's the whole key. This wasn't a cry of defeat. It was a shout of victory, a declaration. The idea being that his death wasn't a mistake. It was the finish line. It was the completion of the entire mission he came to accomplish for all of humanity.
So, he dies on the cross. But the story doesn't end there, not by a long shot. The sources then move on to present what they consider evidence to back up all these incredible claims. And this is where the whole thing shifts from being just a historical debate to something much more personal. One of the first big arguments they bring up is fulfilled prophecy. Now, the claim is pretty astounding, that there are more than 300 predictions about him in the Old Testament. We're talking texts written centuries before he was even born that were fulfilled perfectly in his life and death. And here are just a couple of quick examples to give you an idea. The sources point to a text like Psalm 22, which describes a guy having his hands and feet pierced, and soldiers gambling for his clothes. The really crazy part? That was written hundreds of years before the Romans even invented crucifixion as a form of execution. How do you explain that?
But it's not just about prophecy. The sources also lean on non-biblical history. They point out that his existence and execution aren't just mentioned in the Bible. You have other historians from that time, people who weren't Christians, like the Roman historian Tacitus or the Jewish historian Josephus. They both independently wrote about a man they called Christus being executed in Judea. So his historical reality isn't really up for debate.
So, okay, we've looked at his claims, we've looked at the crucifixion, we've touched on some of the evidence presented, and after all that, the sources bring everything back to one single point. The conclusion is that this whole thing isn't just an academic exercise. It's not just a fun debate about ancient history. No, they argue that the question of who Jesus is actually demands a response from you. It's framed as something way bigger than just an opinion, like who your favorite band is. It's presented as a fundamental decision about reality itself and where you fit into that reality. And that brings us full circle right back to where we started, but with a little twist. The question isn't just some abstract historical thing anymore. Who was Jesus? Based on everything we've looked at today, the final question these sources leave us with is much more direct, much more personal, and it's this: who is Jesus to you?